we have to talk about Jody Wilson Raybould and SNC Lavalin. Let's start with the facts. Wilson Raybould was a Liberal MP from Vancouver. Before being hand-picked by Trudeau as a candidate for the 2015 election, she served 2 terms as the regional chief of the BC Assembly of First Nations. After the 2015 election, she was appointed to the position of Justice Minister and Attorney-General, making her one of the most important members of Trudeau's gender-balanced cabinet. Now, that's actually a really interesting position. On the one hand, the Justice Minister is like any other minister. They're a member of government, responsible to the Parliament and really the Prime Minister, and are in charge of their respective policy portfolio. In this case, the judicial system, mostly. But the Minister of Justice is also the Attorney-General, which is still responsible to government, but is also generally perceived to serve at arm's length. They're the chief law officer of the Crown, not the government, which is basically just the ruling party that's in power, but the Crown, the government as an institution. In this role, they're semi-nonpartisan and serve as the government's primary legal advisor, as well as the government's lawyer. They're supposed to be just and independent, and that's exactly where the problem comes in. You see, there's this rule in Canada that if a company is undergoing charges for criminal behavior, or if they've been charged, then they can't win any new government contracts for a few years. Which makes sense. And SNC Lavalin, a Quebec-based infrastructure construction company, was in the midst of fighting just such a charge. And for Trudeau, this was a problem. SNC Lavalin is a pretty big company that employs a lot of people, and it just so happens to be based in the same province as his own riding. And, probably more importantly, is based in the province that's the most special member of Confederation. The point is, most successful governments need to please Quebec, and that's pretty hard to do if you're exiling their biggest companies. Moreover, it just looks good across Canada to have as much job growth as possible come election time. Anything that makes that more difficult is a problem. So Trudeau and his administration urged the Attorney-General, or she could probably say pressured her, to look into the case, which is being litigated by the Public Prosecution Service of Canada, which the Attorney-General oversees. You know, maybe we could just make this go away and SNC Lavalin can go back to employing people with government contracts. She responds by saying, that'd probably be inappropriate, to which they say, how about you sleep on it? To which she says, yeah, no. It wasn't long after that Trudeau had a cabinet shuffle, and Wilson Raybould was essentially demoted to Minister of Veterans Affairs. The shuffle, which saw changes to lots of different ministers' portfolios, was triggered by a gap that was opened by the resignation of the Treasury Board president, and Trudeau maintains that's the only reason she had to be moved. But after the news that Trudeau's conflict with Wilson Raybould over SNC Lavalin broke, it's easy to see how there might be ulterior motives to that as well. And this has had several implications for Trudeau's government. First of all, it exposed minor, but very serious corruption within the government. It soon became clear that Trudeau's staff and SNC Lavalin executives had had dozens of meetings. At one point, they were exchanging daily updates. And sure, it was good that Trudeau was acting decisively with all the powers at his disposal to protect and promote Canadian jobs. But was that kind of short-term pragmatism really worth sacrificing the rule of law in the long term? Probably not. Trudeau's handling of the ensuing investigation also puts him in a poor light. As the government's lawyer, Jody Wilson Raybould was restricted on how much she could say because of attorney-client privilege, as well as limits on how much cabinet ministers can reveal about government conversations. Trudeau refused to release that privilege to aid the investigation. And then, later on, when an ethics report declared that his government actions were indeed problematic and corrupt, Trudeau said that he accepts the commissioner's findings, but disagrees. Which, to me, sounds like an oxymoron. It also doesn't look too good for Trudeau that he demoted not only a woman from his cabinet, but an Indigenous woman. Now, I think people are getting a little reductive here when they talk about this like it was an important factor in her demotion. I don't think her race or gender are a really good proxy for who she is in this situation. I think her demotion is more a function of her resolve to hold her ground and her respect for the office of Attorney General than it is a function of her societal classifications. But it's also easy to see how it's really hypocritical for a government that talks so much about their gender-balanced cabinet and their respect for Indigenous voices to demote an Indigenous woman as soon as she speaks her mind. And finally, the affair has had some important changes to the personnel of Trudeau's ministry. Trudeau's longtime friend, principal secretary, senior political advisor, and general right-hand man, Gerald Butts, resigned over the issue in an attempt to diffuse the blame away from Trudeau. And now he's gone. As the affair ran on, Jody Wilson Raybould eventually resigned from her cabinet position. Jane Philpott, one of Trudeau's most effective ministers, who served as the Minister of Health, Minister of Indigenous Services, and President of the Treasury Board, also resigned over the Liberals' handling of the issue. Eventually, they were both kicked out of the Liberal Party caucus and are now running as independents in 2019. Ultimately, the importance of SNC Lavalin affair comes down to your own personal choices. If we take a step back, the actions of Trudeau's government aren't really that bad or egregious, and honestly the whole thing is pretty small. But you could also see it as a behind-the-scenes look into Trudeau's Liberals that's indicative of how they do everything. Knowing how they acted here, can you trust them on the bigger things? That's up to you to decide, and the same is true with everything else. They legalized marijuana, but in many ways, they miss the point. They're fighting a hard battle in the name of a carbon tax, but they also bought a pipeline. They're doing more than any other government to promote reconciliation and improve the lives of Indigenous communities, but they're still neglecting them in many regards. So you have to make a choice. Every government has things that they prioritize and things that they neglect. They have to if they want to get anything done, and it's up to you to decide if their 2 steps forward are in the direction that you want to go, and if that's worth sacrificing the things that they're stepping back on. For a lot of people, I think that answer will be yes, but only you can decide that for yourself, based on your own values and priorities. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this video. If it felt like it kind of started abruptly, that's because it did, and that's because it's an excerpt from a 2-parter on Justin Trudeau. Part 1 went over his upbringing and early career, and Part 2 was a semi-detailed overview of his last 4 years in government. And this is an excerpt from that last part. If you'd like to check those out, those will be popping up soonish over here. And since we're about a month away from the election now, I'll also be releasing videos on all the other major party leaders. So there'll be a playlist somewhere around here as well that you can click on to check all those videos out as they're released. And finally, they'll also be available in podcast form pretty soon, and that'll be linked down in the description. Thanks for watching.